A bit of a backstory on the black-eyed children. They are known to be between the ages of 6 and 16. Many reports of encounters with these strange children have poured in over the years. Every person who encounters them almost always describes them as pale-skinned, dressed in weird old-fashioned clothing and completely black eyes with no white visible, coupled with an overwhelming feeling of fear or dread during their interaction with these creepy children. One common thing people say is, if they knock, never let them in. No one has ever let them in, so it isn't known what happens if they are let inside. After working late one night, I cleared my desk and headed for the underground parking lot. As I stepped out of the elevator, I noticed the fluorescent lights flickering, and all I could hear was the dull hum of machinery and the sound of my own footsteps. It was well past midnight and the place was deserted. I reached my car and fumbled for my keys, opened the door and got into my car. I turned the key and the engine stuttered and spat, but eventually roared to life. I sighed with relief, eager to get home, but just as I was about to shift into drive, I heard a knock on the window. Out of nowhere, a boy aged about 13 stood there. His skin was unnaturally pale and his clothes looked old-fashioned, but it was his eyes that made my blood run cold. They were entirely black, no whites in his eyes, as if they were endless voids. With a voice flat and emotionless, he asked, "Can you give me a ride?" Every instinct screamed at me to drive away, but I was frozen in place. For some unknown reason, I was filled with fear. My mind was racing. Should I run him over? Should I just ignore him? 1,000 questions raced through my mind as his eyes bore into mine. I can't, I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." The boy's expression didn't change. "Please," he insisted. "I need a ride. Please let me in." I shook my head, unable to look away from those terrifying eyes. "I can't help you." For a moment, he simply stared at me. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. My heart pounded. I slammed the car into reverse and sped towards the exit. As I reached the exit, I saw some figures in my headlights, standing in the middle of the driveway. It was the boy, and 3 more of those evil black-eyed friends. They stared at me with an intensity that made me want to cry. All 3 of them started walking towards my car, and that's when I floored the gas pedal, swerving around them and burst into the street. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, glancing in the rearview mirror. I could see them chasing after me, but as I turned a corner, they were gone. To this day, I have no idea what I had experienced, but I sure as hell never worked late again. I love Saturdays. The kids go out shopping or hang out with their friends. My husband plays golf, and I have the entire Saturday to myself, just doing whatever I want. The mall is within walking distance from our house, so I wasn't too concerned about the children. They always come back at night. I was out in the front garden weeding when I suddenly had this weird feeling, a feeling of utter fear at the pit of my stomach. I had no idea what it was, as I was alone, and as far as I know, no one was near me. As I came up onto my knees, I saw a bunch of kids standing across the road staring at me. They were between 10 and 14 years old. I rushed to my feet, turned around as fast as I could, and ran inside, locking the door behind me. "What on earth is the matter with you?" I scolded myself. These were just kids, but something about them was off. I could have sworn when I looked over at them, standing across the road, I saw they all had black eyes. I stood for a few minutes peeking through the net curtains at the front door, watching the kids. They were just standing there staring at the front door. I walked to the kitchen and brewed some coffee when suddenly there was a knock at the door. "Holy crap," I said. "Please don't let it be those kids." I had no idea why I was so afraid of them. I silently walked to the front door and watched them through the curtain. One of them was on the front porch and the rest were on the curb. My hands were trembling as I moved the curtain to the side and looked directly at this child's face. He was ghostly white, expressionless, and had black eyes. Yes, you heard me. Black eyes, no white anywhere. "Hello, ma'am," the boy on the porch said. "May I use your phone to call our mom?" As he said that, the rest of the children stepped off the curb and started walking towards the house. "Our parents are late. I just need to phone them." To me, it was strange that they didn't have a cell phone between them, and when I asked the question, the boy said that the battery was dead. By now, I was visibly shaking. I told him I can't let them use the phone and suggested they go to the police station. I let go of the curtain and started walking away. A louder knock on the door. I walked back to the front door, ripped the curtain sideways, and in a very irritated voice I asked, "Yes?" The boy asked if they could come in and use the bathroom. Through the glass, I told him no, they should walk to the mall and use the restrooms there. All 6 of them stared at me with those cold black eyes. It was the creepiest thing ever. I quickly dropped the curtain and moved away from the door. About 30 minutes later, I went over to the front door to check if they had left, but there they were on the curb staring at the house. My hair stood on edge as I watched them. I moved the curtain from the window, took out my cell phone to let them see I was making a call. It wasn't long before they turned and walked down the street. I have never in my life been so scared. Something is up with those kids. They aren't normal. They're not human, and I'm scared to death they'll come back. Halloween, as we all know, is one of the jolliest days of the year. People in our neighborhood, and specifically our street, tend to try and outdo one another with decorations. The costumes, the thrill of the unknown, it all excited me. This year I decided to stay home and hand out candy to the trick-or-treaters. It was the perfect night for Halloween. It was warm, the sky was clear, and there was a full moon. Very eerie. Excitedly, children would come to the door all screaming, "Trick or treat," and I'd fill their bowls or cups with sweets. After a while, things started dying down and the street started clearing. I turned off the porch light and started settling in for the night. Around 11 p.m., there was a knock at the door. I opened the door a crack, making sure my foot blocked the door from the inside. 2 children were standing there, a boy aged 11 and a girl about 8 years old. Their costumes were simple, almost vintage, and their skin was unnaturally pale. But it was their eyes that made my stomach drop. Their eyes were completely black. "Trick or treat," they said in unison, their voices flat and emotionless. I couldn't tear my gaze from their eyes, and for some unknown reason, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. "I'm sorry, but I think it's time for you to go home," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can we come in?" the girl asked, her tone unchanging. "No," I replied, my heart pounding. "You can't come in. Go home, it's late." They stared at me for a moment longer, their black eyes boring into mine. Then the boy asked, "Can I use your bathroom?" "No," I said. They turned and looked at each other and then looked back at me. The boy stepped closer to the door. "We need to come inside," he said, and pushed the door with his hand. At that moment, I was grateful that my foot was blocking him from pushing it open. "You need to go home," I said. I slammed the door shut, locking it, and turned off the porch light. They stood there for another 15 minutes staring at the door, and without another word they turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. What the hell was that? I said to myself. I couldn't shake a feeling of terror at the pit of my stomach. I struggled to fall asleep that night. It was also the last Halloween that I participated in. I think I'm scarred for life. These were no ordinary children. It was something far more evil than a Halloween prank. I've never heard of or had any encounter with black-eyed kids, but this all changed when one day I was sitting in the car waiting for my mom. She'd gone shopping and I wasn't in the mood to shop with her, so I stayed in the car. About 15 minutes later, I saw a kid who I thought was from our school walking back and forth along the sidewalk in front of our car. I watched him for a while as he paced up and down, and then I banged on the windshield to get his attention. He had paced with his back to me, but turned around and faced me when he heard the banging. He started walking towards the car and stopped on my side. He just stood there staring. That's when I saw his eyes, black as the night. Everything black, not a smudge of white anywhere. This freaked me out. My eyes widened and all I wanted to do was scream. The boy whispers through the closed window, "You must let me in." At this point, I started screaming and fell with my head onto the seat, covering my eyes. I couldn't stop screaming. I had never been so scared in my life. 30 minutes must have passed before I had the courage to lift my head and look through the windscreen. The boy was gone. I've never encountered anything like this before. What would have happened to me if I had opened the door for him? Would I even be here to tell this story? Back in 1997, my friends and I went to see the movie Scream 2. This was one of my favorite movies, but I remember that I was so on edge afterwards that any sound would make me jump. After the movie, we decided to have some dinner. At about 11:30, we all went our separate ways. I headed to my car, which I parked almost at the very far end of the parking lot, and there weren't many lights so far back. I opened the driver's door and locked it again as soon as I got in. I popped in Puff Daddy's CD, "Can't Nobody Hold Me Down," turned on my headlights and adjusted my rearview mirror. It was at that moment that I saw a small person at the back of my car. He started walking towards my door. My heart sank to my shoes. Now you would think this is strange that I would be scared of a small kid, but he wasn't normal. I had this utter feeling of dread. It was the creepiest kid I'd ever seen. He was yai-high, no expression on his face, and he had the blackest of black eyes. I've never seen anything like it. My heart was pounding. He knocked on my window, but all I could do was stare at him as he asked me for a ride. Said he was lost and had no way of getting home. I didn't open my window. I just stared at him. It was as if I was in a trance. After he knocked the second time, he said, "Sir, please can you give me a ride?" It was so creepy. I was waiting for the white mask and knife to appear in his hands. I shook my head and said, "Sorry, no," put the car in reverse and sprinted out of there as fast as I could. In my rearview mirror, I saw him glare at me with those horrible black eyes. When I got home, I was still shaking. To this day, I have no idea what I had seen. I'm not even sure if it was real or just my nerves from Scream 2 movie I just watched, but I'm glad that I didn't give him a lift. Who knows what would have happened if I'd let him in? I lived in a cottage on the outskirts of town. It was cold and raining and the wind was blowing. Everything was quiet inside except for the creaking of the old wooden beams and the rustle of leaves outside. It was about 9 p.m. I was sitting by the fireplace having a glass of wine when there was a loud knock at the door. I froze staring at the door. No one ever came out this far, especially not in weather like this. I got up and opened the door a crack. There were a group of children standing at my door. They were creepy looking. They had these weird black eyes. When I say black eyes, I don't mean black eyes from a beating. I mean really black eyes. I've never seen anyone with complete black eyes before. It was like a bottomless pit. No expression, no soul. My heart pounded as I looked at them. They were drenched from the rain and their skin was almost ghostly pale. But it was their eyes that held me captive. "Can you let us in?" The girl asked. Her voice had no emotion whatsoever. Without warning, I was overcome by fear. Every fiber of my being screamed to shut the door, to lock it, and never open it again. "No," I said, my voice shaking. "You can't come in." I felt bad saying that because they were wet and cold, but this feeling of panic was so overwhelming that I didn't care. "Please," the boy added, "we need to call our parents." I shook my head, unable to tear my gaze from their eyes. "I'm sorry. I can't help you." For a moment, they simply stood there staring at me with those empty black eyes. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart racing. They continued pounding at the door, shouting, "You have to let us in," but I ignored it. I just sat silently by the fire without making a sound. I could hear the rain beating down outside, but I wasn't going to open that door for anything or anyone. I am 100% sure that those children weren't human. This experience shook me. After that experience, I'm quite nervous out here without anyone close by. I've also learned not to answer the door if I didn't invite someone over. I enjoyed my late-night walks, the quiet streets and cool air. It helped me unwind. I usually drive, then park and walk down to the beach. It helps me unwind from the day's chaos. Tonight was no different, or so I thought. It was a full moon and the streets were deserted. As I rounded a corner, I noticed some children standing under a street lamp. They wore weird clothes and their skin was so pale, it almost seemed like it was glowing in the moonlight. But it was their eyes that stopped me in my tracks, completely black like twin voids. Before I reached them, I crossed the road and continued walking. Every now and then I would look over my shoulder just to check if they were following me. I walked for about 30 minutes and headed back the same way I came. The children were gone. I reached my car that was parked under a street lamp, unlocked the door, and climbed inside. As I put the key in the ignition, I heard, "Can you help us?" I turned my head and saw one of the boys that was previously standing on the sidewalk. The others were now slightly behind him. I hesitated and inexplicable dread suddenly drowned me. "What do you need?" I asked without opening my window. "Can you give us a ride home?" The girl replied, her tone matching the boy's calm voice. Every instinct screamed at me to drive, but I was rooted to the spot. "I can't," I finally managed to say. "I'm sorry. Please, it's not far. Our parents will be worried." For a moment they simply stared at me, their eyes almost piercing through my soul. I didn't even answer. I turned the ignition and pulled off my tires, screeching through the empty streets. The black-eyed children stared at my car until I faded into the distance. My heart was racing and my knuckles turned white as I was gripping the steering wheel. When I got home, I jumped out the car and bolted into my house. I've never seen them again.